The Robert Scott Bell Show.
I did want to get your impression of the generation gap as we start here. Why it is you feel in the appeal to Ron Paul to the young people, and I consider myself, even though I'm in the middle of that age group, I'm not the youngest anymore. But yes, have that young at heart feel. What is it about the elder generations that haven't fully caught on to what Ron's all about? Because I've actually convinced my mom, who's 77, and she's from Israel when it was Palestine became Israel. So she's actually on board with Ron Paul. So it's not that we can't convince our moms and grandmas to do this, but the question is, what is it that they're missing?
I think there's a couple of answers to this. Number one is, how are they getting their information in the first place? And I think vastly disproportionately, those 65 and over are getting their news from the same sources they would have gotten it from 20 years ago. And so they're still getting it from media that thinks it's their job to more or less tell the public what they should think, which candidates are respectable, and to filter information for them. And so naturally, if you had nothing but a diet of, heaven forbid, Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, then you would think that, well, this Ron Paul is a crazy man. I think he likes our enemies and blah, blah, blah. I mean, really, it's like a second grade level that they're pitching it at. But if that's all you hear, you might be inclined to accept it. Whereas the young people, like people ages 18 to 30, I don't think I have seen in the last 5 years one person in that age group holding a newspaper, physically holding one. They don't get their news that way. They get their news from sources they trust, or on the internet, or through alternative media. They're constantly having friends send them YouTubes and whatever. So they get their information directly, and that, I think, makes the difference. But also, as you get older, and you become set in your ways, you become more conventional, and I think a lot of older folks are looking for a Republican candidate they've been led to expect, who repeats the slogans they expect to hear, who repeats the talking points they expect to hear. Ron doesn't do any of that. So naturally your inclination is to say, there must be something wrong with this guy. Instead of thinking to yourself, well, you know what, maybe I've been wrong for 40 years. Very few people are going to make it. It takes a heroic act of self-abnegation to admit something like that.
Well, as I relate my own experience in talking with my mom, not everybody has moms that listen to their sons, right? You probably have mom stuff. We all do. But she listens. I give her props. She's on at 77 on no drugs. I brag about her. And so I know she'll listen. And yet there were some contentious times. It's like, oh, Ron Paul, he's not for Israel. And we really had to go through this because, she's actively involved in certain communities there that are all about Israel. And I said, Mom, would you rather have Israel determining its own future, or do you want the American presidents, whoever they might be, to dictate the policy of Israel? She said, well, no, I would rather have Israel decide that. And we went through it all, and she, finally came to the conclusion, you're right, he's not against Israel, for instance. He's all about freedom for everybody. And so that was one thing where I guess in my own way I was doing not Operation Grandma, but Operation Mom before you came out with Operation Grandma.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And again, explaining his position in a non-tendentious way. I mean, just explaining it, being fair about it, and not with the media slant and spin. But I think one more thing on the younger people issue is that maybe 30 years ago it was easy to think, we need a heftier military budget, we need more invasions, we need this and that. When you've got a healthy country with a high savings rate and the debt is under control, then you sort of have the luxuries. But I think some of the kids are thinking to themselves that we're inheriting an impossible level of debt. The entitlement programs are going to crush the young people, and the idea that you're going to add on to that with gratuitous military intervention, which is what a lot of us think the Iraq War was, is just unthinkable to them.
Well, based on that perspective of the difference in foreign policy, I always like to get to that because that's the one area that seemingly the most difficult for a lot in America to really get. How would you rate the candidates, the three that were still on stage last night, Santorum, Gingrich, and Romney? I mean, they don't seem to have a core conviction, except in the last debate, it was all about Newt Gingrich saying, kill him. And then Romney goes, yeah, I agree with Gingrich, kill him. And they got huge applause lines. And then they booed Jesus and the Golden Rule when Ron Paul said, maybe we ought to think about this differently.
I think it's hard to distinguish the non-Paul candidates on foreign policy at this point. I do know some people who are not so persuaded by Romney's hawkishness that they think that he's doing that as another chameleon move that basically he thinks, well, the stupid rubes in the GOP want me to be a warmonger, so I'll be that. Whatever. It's like the old Groucho Marx line, that's my philosophy, and if you don't like it, I have others. So I think there's a little bit of that going on, but I at least, well, I don't know. I hate to try to find saving graces for any of these people, but I think the most contemptible one of the three is Santorum, simply because I think he is by far the least knowledgeable. Normally, when you're not knowledgeable about something, you try to reserve judgment, not rush into things, but he is the least knowledgeable and yet the most bellicose. I remember in an earlier debate, the subject of Iran came up, and Santorum said, Iran has been at war with us since the late 1970s. And Ron Paul said, I think you're leaving out a little bit of the history there. And he was, as far as I know, the first and only presidential candidate to point out that the U.S. government installed the Shah of Iran against the will of the Iranian people in 1953, and the CIA helped to depose the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who was basically just a secular ruler, but somebody who wanted to nationalize oil companies, or at least to establish with the British oil companies the same kind of deal, frankly, that the American oil companies had accepted in other countries, and that was unacceptable to the British, and they roped the CIA into getting involved by claiming that Mossadegh was a communist, which he was not. But the point is that Ron Paul tells this to Santorum, and he says, look at what we did to these poor people, imposing this dictator on them. And I'm not joking. You can watch the YouTube for yourself. Santorum came back and said, I'm not going to apologize for spreading freedom. I mean, that is straight out of Orwell. Spreading freedom. I mean, the Shah was, I suppose there are worse dictators than the Shah, but he so suppressed political opposition that what he basically did was he forced political opposition into the mosques. He was certainly not going to interfere with Islam. So Islam became the one area where you could really have political dissent. So naturally then, the late 1970s, it explodes in Iran, and where is it centered? In the mosques. So all these, Ron Paul talks about unintended consequences all the time. That's a huge unintended consequence. But the neocons always want to start with the end of the story. They don't want to start with how things got going. They want to say, oh my gosh, there's this crazy development. It's like, oh my gosh, here's Hitler, without saying, well, where'd he come from?
How did it happen?
If it hadn't been for World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, there wouldn't have been a Hitler. They don't want to consider that. They don't want to consider that maybe their intervention led to some of the undesirable outcomes later on.
Yeah, I liken it to the worst of modern medicine. I've acknowledged here there are good points, especially in emergency trauma medicine. But in a sense, if you go to a doctor with a problem and the doctor cares not for what was the cause of the problem and says, here, let's just take out that body part because God obviously goofed. It is like, well, I still have function of it, but it's giving you a problem. Let's just remove it and pretend it wasn't needed. And there's a lot of that thinking in Santorum and others in the so-called, what we call the neoconservative movement. Yesterday on the air, Super Don, my producer, and I dismantled the neocon of neocons, Bill Kristol. I called him Bill Kristol Meth because he's absolutely out of his mind with the things he was saying, and he wanted Ron Paul to leave the Republican Party. And there was a interviewer that we had the footage from that asked him about what's the problem, and Bill Kristol says it's not that we haven't been intervening, it's that we haven't been intervening enough. And so the guy goes back and he's shaking his head, going, "Wait a second! Since World War II ended, we have on record 72 foreign interventions." I hadn't realized it was this high. 72 foreign interventions the U.S. Explain to me how that's not enough. And it was just after time, you begin to see these people, just like you said with Santorum, they cannot grasp history. They literally have to rewrite it in their own minds and believe their BS.
Well, Bill Kristol, of course, deserved everything you shelled out to him and more. And for him to say Ron Paul should leave the party is pretty rich. I mean, Kristol should leave. Kristol has been basically a big government conservative. He's when the Republicans took over in '94, it was Crystal who was advising them, don't do anything. Don't actually repeal anything. Let's wait till we win the White House. Yeah. Let's wait till 1996 when Bob Dole might get elected. Then we'll really see some action. We'll be cooking with gas then, right, Bill?
Oh,
and it's always never the opportune time to repeal or cut anything, according to Bill Kristol. And then he also believes in so-called national greatness conservatism, which should fill you with Orwellian goodness. National greatness conservatism just means bombing everybody and having a centralized government and a big budget. That's that. We model ourselves after Teddy Roosevelt. Traditional conservatives don't talk that way. Traditional conservatives believe in local, finite goals of hearth and home. They don't go for this national greatness propaganda nonsense. But so it's Kristol who should pack his bags.